Hello, everyone, and welcome to True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. I am Alan G., and I am your host. If you like what you see, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. In 1911, Atlanta, Georgia, it was considered the gateway to the New South, at least by Atlanta itself. Less than 4 decades after Sherman burned Atlanta in a bid to destroy the morale of Southerners and cripple the ability of major cities like Atlanta to transport goods from place to place, nearly a dozen railroads were now passing through Georgia's capital city. There was a major boom in business, leading to Inman Park and Peachtree Street being much sought after as residences for the wealthy. But in the midst of this economic boom, an assailant raised his head above the evil that subsisted below the surface of Atlanta society, causing great consternation amongst blacks and whites alike, and reminding the general public of a killer some 23 years before who was never caught. The people of Atlanta hoped that this time such a savage killer would eventually meet with justice. Instead, it appeared there would be no end to the reign of the man or men named the Atlanta Ripper.
At the turn of the 20th century, Atlanta, Georgia wanted to project itself as being racially tolerant, touting Morris Brown, Atlanta University, and Atlanta Baptist as some of the best black schools in the nation. Black-owned businesses were also cropping up, lending credence to the idea of a New South. However, the majority of the city's minority residents, rather than having their own businesses, worked long hours in menial jobs, doing manual labor, and living in the less desirable areas of Reynoldstown and Pittsburgh. 5 years earlier, in 1906, 40 black men had died as a result of a rampage in which a mob of white men had run rampant through the city after unsubstantiated reports of 4 white women being assaulted by black men. The tension and the ugliness of the riot was still very much alive in Atlanta. Segregation was the law at the time. Blacks could not walk through white parks. They could not eat in white restaurants. They could not drink in white bars. They could not drink from white water fountains. And they could not be buried in white cemeteries. Accordingly, the city's white residents actively took steps to keep their white-only neighborhoods white. In July of 1911, white residents of Ashby Street held a meeting in which they debated ways to keep blacks out after 4 black families had moved in. And so it wasn't surprising that when a murder spree started, the press and authorities gave it little concern. It's not possible to say with certainty exactly when the crime spree started, and absolutely who was the first victim. But on Monday, October 3rd, 1910, 23-year-old Maggie Brooks's body was found at the intersection of the Atlanta and West Point Railroad track and Hill Street. A cook, Maggie's skull had been fractured. On Saturday, January 22nd, 1911, 35-year-old Rosa Trice had the left side of her skull nearly completely crushed. Her jaw was stabbed and her throat was cut so viciously that her head was nearly severed from her neck. After being killed, the perpetrator drug her body some 75 yards from her house on Gardner Street in the Pittsburgh neighborhood before abandoning it there, where it was discovered. 2 hours after her body was found, her husband was arrested for her murder but released the following night for lack of evidence. The Atlanta Constitution reported her murder, including the grisly details of the killing. On Sunday, February 19, 1911, the body of an unidentified black female was discovered in some woods by the West Point Belt Car Line, just outside the city limits. She was estimated to be 25 years old, and her head had been crushed. Beer bottles had been scattered around her body. It was suspected she had been killed either on Friday, February 17th or Saturday, February 18th. On Sunday morning, May 28, 1911, the body of Mary Bell Walker was found just 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. A cook working in a private home on Cooper Street, Bell was found by her sister when she failed to return home from work the night before. Her throat had been cut in a jagged fashion. The Atlanta Constitution duly reported the crime in their May 29th edition on page 7, noting that a black woman had been killed and there were no clues. In the early morning hours of Thursday, June 15, 1911, Addie Watts, a resident of 30 Selman Street, was found in some shrubbery at Krog and DeKalb Streets, close to the Southern Railway. Authorities believed that she had first been hit in the head with a brick or a coupling pin from a train before her killer had stabbed at her skull with a coupling pin and then slit her throat. After she had been killed, she was dragged into the bushes near the tracks. It was only after Addie Watts was discovered that the local papers began to speculate that there may have been a lone, solitary killer preying on the city's young black women. On June 16, 1911, the day after the Watts killing, the Atlanta Journal ran a headline questioning whether a black butcher was at work in the city. It was this brief article, only 4 paragraphs, that first linked the Atlanta murders to those that occurred in London in the autumn of 1888, where 5 prostitutes were brutally stabbed to death and mutilated by the infamous Jack the Ripper. According to the article, the police were advancing the theory that Atlanta had an insane criminal, something on the order of the famed Jack the Ripper. The competing Atlanta Constitution, however, was still holding firm that the killings were isolated and unrelated incidents. On Saturday, June 24, 1911, Lizzie Watkins, a resident of West Oakland Street, became the next victim. She was found around 11 a.m. the following day at White and Lawson Streets. Like Addie Watts, she was found in a clump of bushes. Also like Addie Watts, Lizzie's throat had been cut and her body had been dragged to where it was found after the fatal injury. Following the Lizzie Watkins murder, the crimes were finally moved to the front page of the Atlanta Journal. The similarities between the victims and the murders was pointed out, as was the fact that for 5 Saturdays in a row, young black or biracial women had been murdered. Through these reports, the public found out for the first time that in each case, it appeared the women were choked into unconsciousness before they were assaulted and killed, and that the victims had been mutilated in the same areas of their bodies. Although not specified in the newspaper reports at the time due to the delicate nature, like London's Jack the Ripper victims, Atlanta's Ripper victims were not sexually assaulted, but their injuries appeared sexual in nature. Also, like the British Ripper, the Atlanta reporters claimed that the local killer had some type of anatomical knowledge. Once again, the Atlanta Constitution was behind the 8 ball. Although it reported the most recent murder, the Constitution incorrectly opined that Lizzie Watkins' death was due to cocaine and whiskey. The first possible break or lead in the case came on Saturday, July 1st, 1911, with the murder of 40-year-old Lena Sharp. The Sharp case is notable not only for the eyewitness encounter, but also for 2 varying versions of what happened. In the first version, as reported by the Atlanta Constitution, Lena told her 20-year-old daughter, Emma Lou, that she was walking to the market. When Lena had not returned to the Sharp home on Hanover Street within an hour, Emma Lou headed toward the market in search of her mother. As the Sharps' neighbor, Addie Watts, had been killed only 2 weeks prior, Emma Lou was frightened to learn that her mother never arrived at her destination. She was walking back toward the family home when she was confronted by a tall black man in a wide-brimmed black hat who asked her, "How do you feel this evening?" Feeling apprehensive, She moved past him, and he responded with, "Don't worry, I never hurt girls like you." Emma Lou was then stabbed in the back while the man ran off laughing. She screamed, alerting a group of neighbors who came to her assistance. While Emma Lou survived, her mother did not. Lena Sharp's body was found shortly after her daughter's attack, with her head in a pool of blood and her throat cut. In the second version, as reported by the Atlanta Journal, Lena and Emma Lou were walking together to the store when the black man, who had been hiding, blocked their path and struck Lena in the head with a brick. Lena fell to the ground, and the man began slashing at Emma Lou, never uttering a word. Emma Lou ran from the scene, screaming, but fainted due to blood loss. It was then that the killer cut Lena's throat so severely that her head was nearly severed from her body. He returned to Emma Lou, who had regained consciousness, and saw him standing over her with a bloody knife. Only the sound of feet running toward them sent the killer scurrying for cover. Whichever version was accurate, Lena Sharp was indeed killed and very nearly decapitated, with her body found by the Seaboard Railroad tracks, and Emma Lou Sharp was stabbed. She also got a good look at the man who stabbed her and quite probably murdered her mother. Detectives working the case almost immediately deduced that the same man who had stabbed Emma Lou had killed her mother, and had gone so far as to connect the same man to the murder of their neighbor, Addie Watts, and the other victims. The Sharp assaults and murder prompted the Atlanta Constitution to declare by July 4th that the Jack the Ripper theory had now been given further substance. A $250 reward was offered by Undertaker L.L. Lee for the capture of the man who killed Lena Sharp. Mr. Lee also requested that other black business owners open their wallets to increase the reward fund, making it more enticing and hopefully encouraging residents to assist the police and bring the guilty party to justice. Coroner Paul Donahue stated that the killings were the work of the same man, i.e., a single killer. The city held its breath as another weekend approached. An unnamed policeman was quoted as saying the killer would take another victim Saturday before midnight. The unnamed policeman was right and wrong. 22-year-old Mary Yeldell left the home of Mr. and Mrs. W.M. Seltzer on 4th Street, where she was employed as a cook. Walking by an alley, she heard a whistle and stopped. A large black man, tall and well-built, was moving toward her, as she later stated, with a cat-like tread. She screamed and ran back to the Seltzer house, where Mr. Seltzer grabbed his revolver and headed for the alley. The man, surprisingly, was still there. When Mr. Seltzer ordered him to raise his hands or be shot, the man ran down the alley. The police were called, but turned up nothing. If, like Emma Lou Sharp, Mary Yeldell had come face to face with the Atlanta Ripper, she had been fortunate enough to not only survive, but survive without injuries. The Yeldell incident appeared to have broken the Saturday night streak, but the Ripper wasn't done yet. On Sunday, July 9th, a meeting was held at the First Congregational Church in Atlanta, where the church's pastor, Henry Hugh Proctor, along with other black leaders in the community, asked that every black resident in Atlanta use his or her resources to locate the killer. While asking its black residents to cooperate fully with the police, the community also began requesting the police force to hire black detectives to assist in the hunt. Due to the segregation that was present in the city, Reverend Proctor and others believed that black detectives would receive more cooperation from the black community members, as well as being less invasive. On Tuesday morning, July 11th, a workman by the name of Will Brogland discovered some loose dirt on his normal route to work. Sensing distress, he followed the disturbance to a bloody trail in the road of Atlanta Avenue and Martin Street, near the new Orme Street sewer. He found the body of Sadie Holly, who worked at a local foundry, in a small gully, where it had lain since the previous night. Sadie's skull had been fractured with a large stone, after which she was dragged roughly 15 feet and her throat slashed ear to ear so violently she was nearly decapitated. Her shoes had been cut from her feet, and a comb from her hair was found next to the bloody rock used to bludgeon her. The soft dirt by her body indicated her killer's route of escape. An estimated 100 onlookers were at the crime scene within 20 minutes of the discovery of the body. By the time the coroner arrived, the crowd had swelled to some 500, leading to a general sense of hysteria. The victim count was increasing, but the police seemed no closer to apprehending the suspect. There was a brief glimmer of hope when 27-year-old laborer Henry Huff was arrested on July 11th, less than 24 hours after Sadie Holly's body was found at his home on Brotherton Street. Huff reportedly had been the last person seen with Holly and possessed trousers with a bloodstain on them, dirt up to the knees, and scratches on his arms. A cabman by the name of Will Williams claimed that Huff and Holly had been in his cab quarreling before he let them off near where the murder took place. Huff, however, was only held on suspicion. Not long after picking up Huff, police picked up 35-year-old Todd Henderson at a saloon on Decatur Street after a man claimed that Henderson had been seen with Sadie Holly in a drugstore on the night of her murder not far from the scene. Emma Lou Sharp was brought into the station to listen to Henderson's voice. She shrank back upon hearing him, although Emma Lou's identification was not considered solid or absolute. The lady herself told reporters that Henderson was the man, and if not, she would be badly mistaken. For his part, Henderson was quoted as saying that if he were the Ripper, he would have begun on his wife, as she gave him lots of trouble. Police, however, grew more suspicious of Henderson after he asserted to detectives that he had not owned a pocket knife or a razor in over a year, and they found that on the morning after Sadie Holly's murder, he had dropped off a razor to a barber to be sharpened. The case against both Henderson and Huff were purely circumstantial, but police turned them over to the prosecutor, thinking the grand jury would figure out which man to indict in Sadie Holly's murder. Several days later, Governor Hokie Smith offered a $250 reward for the capture of the Atlanta Ripper. On July 16th, Reverend Proctor, who had asked Atlanta's residents to assist in finding the Ripper, preached to his congregation at the Black First Congregational Church that the hand of God was seen in the work of the Ripper and that the sins of the victims themselves were to blame. On August 9, 1911, the grand jury indicted Henry Huff for the murder of Sadie Holly, and a new suspect, a man by the name of John Daniel Huff, no relation to Henry Huff, in a related case, although the grand jury wouldn't say which one. Despite the arrests, the Ripper's reign of terror on the streets of Atlanta continued. On Thursday, August 31, 1911, more than 6 weeks after the ravaging of Sadie Holly, the body of 20-year-old Mary Ann Duncan was found in an area west of Atlanta called Blandtown. Lying in between railroad tracks, Mary, like previous victims, had suffered a horrific throat wound, going from ear to ear. Like Sadie Holly, her shoes had been removed. This newest slaying made the media and the police certain that they had not arrested the real Ripper despite the grand jury indictments. On Sunday, October 22, 1911, the body of Eva Florence was found in a field at Rockwell and Elizabeth Streets. She had been killed the night before, beaten in the head and stabbed in the neck, but not slashed as the other victims. Her brother, John Clowers, a waiter, posted a $100 reward with the police for the apprehension of the killer. The coroner's inquest found that a firearm had been discharged on Elizabeth Street shortly before or at the time of the Florence murder. On Friday, November 10, 1911, Minnie Wise, described by the newspapers as a comely mulatto girl, was found dead in an alley. She had been bludgeoned with a rock, dragged into a field on Connolly Street, where her throat was cut, and then dragged 20 more feet to where she was discovered, near the corner of Georgia Avenue. Her right index finger had been hacked off at the middle joint, and her shoes were missing. Minnie was found close to where 2 other victims had been murdered. Early Tuesday morning, November 21, 1911, middle-aged Mary Putnam fell prey, being slashed to death. Her body was found around 7 a.m. in a ditch at Stewart Street and University Avenue, buried under some loose dirt. Her throat had been cut, her chest mutilated, and her heart was found lying next to her. Her autopsy would reveal that she also suffered a broken skull. As prints were seen in the dirt around Mary's corpse, police brought a bloodhound in to attempt to track her killer. The dog was able to follow the scent for about 200 yards before losing it. Mary had been a recent Atlanta transplant, having moved to the area to keep house for an elderly black man who the police did not consider a suspect. More than 1,000 people viewed Mary's body at the undertaker's, including Mary's stepson, Walter, who did not identify himself or his stepmother at the time, but only after returning to work as an elevator operator when he informed a passenger. Walter claimed he feared he would be arrested if he had spoken up any earlier. The coroner's inquest into the Putnam case revealed that, as in the Florence case, a firearm had been discharged around midnight. Following the Putnam homicide, an unnamed detective bemoaned to a reporter from the Constitution that the case would never be solved until we get some help from the blacks. He felt that the community knew who was committing the murders but were afraid to talk. If the city had the money, the community would be willing to offer up what it knew. At Big Bethel Church, pastors warned their female congregants about going out at night, while collecting $1,200 to go toward the reward for the Ripper's capture. Henry Huff, who had been indicted for murdering Sadie Holly, was found not guilty by a Fulton County jury. During his trial, Sheriff Plenty Minor suggested that jealous black women were responsible for the slayings, not men at all. This theory was roundly laughed at by the police officers and detectives. On Friday, January 12, 1912, Pearl Williams had her throat slashed. She was found the next morning in a vacant lot at Chestnut and West Flair, only a block from her home. Like so many others, Pearl had worked as a cook in a private home. On March 12th of 1912, the grand jury concluded that the Atlanta Ripper was a myth and each murder had been committed by a different man, the result of jealousy following immoral conduct. How the grand jury reached this conclusion, though, was never explained. On Monday, April 8, 1912, 18-year-old Mary Cates was discovered in an alley, her throat cut and her body mutilated. Her clothing was found in a neat pile next to her body. The Lexington, Kentucky's local newspaper reported that the murder in their April 9th edition, noting that the mutilation on Mary was done by a surgical instrument and the slayer had some anatomical knowledge. On Monday morning, April 15, 1912, the body of an unidentified black female was discovered in the Chattahoochee River by the Chattahoochee Brick Company and underneath the Southern Railway Bridge. Discovered by the chief engineer of the brick company, he and his two men brought the body back to the Fulton County side of the river. Her throat had been slashed, and around her neck was a string with a key tied very tightly to it. She was estimated to be just 15 years old. Also during that month of April, the body of an unidentified 19-year-old black female was found in a clump of bushes at the end of Pryor Street. She had been stabbed in the throat. On Saturday, May 11, 1912, at 6 a.m., the body of an unidentified black female was discovered behind shrubbery at the corner of Atlanta Avenue and Fraser Street. She had been stabbed in the throat at least twice, with one wound going through her jugular vein. Her body had been dragged after death. At the time she was found, she had been dead for approximately 6 hours. On August 12, 1912, Henry Brown, aka Lawton Brown, was arrested for killing Eva Florence in October of 1911. Brown's wife informed the authorities that he had come home on successive Saturdays, the same Saturdays that many killings had taken place, wearing bloody clothing. While being questioned, Brown reportedly revealed details of other crimes, and police felt certain they had their man. In October, Brown went to trial for Eva Florence's murder. A man by the name of John Rutherford testified that the police had chained Brown's arms and legs to a chair and struck him in the head until he confessed. Brown, while on the stand, testified that he suffered from hallucinations. The jury acquitted him on October 18th, feeling he would confess to anything under pressure. On Tuesday, February 11th, 1913, the body of a young black girl was found at Fair and Christian Streets, estimated to be no more than 20 years old. The victim had suffered a cut to the face as well as terrible slashing to her throat and was badly bruised about the head and chest. The inquest determined that her slayer had stabbed her in the head until his knife broke while holding her in a vice-like grip. Based on the direction of a number of footprints found by her body, as well as the marks of a small rubber-tired buggy, police believe that the killer had returned to her body and turned it over to verify that she was indeed dead. She had been wearing a blue corded suit, brown stockings, and high-top patent leather boots. In March of 1913, Laura Smith was found with her throat cut. She, like the others, was young, of mixed heritage, and worked as a servant. A year later, in March of 1914, firefighters found notes stuck to fireboxes throughout the city which threatened to cut the throats of all black women who were on the streets after a certain hour of the night. On Sunday, June 24th, 1917, two boys picking blackberries early that morning discovered the partially concealed body of an unknown black woman just beyond the Atlanta and West Point Belt line, 300 yards from Stewart Avenue. Her skull had been crushed and battered by a heavy and sharp instrument. School children discovered the body of an unidentified black female by Clark University campus around 2:30 p.m. on Monday, October 1st, 1917. The body was in a mud puddle with the head crushed and numerous other marks of violence about her person. She was dressed in a black skirt and estimated to be between 30 and 35 years old. In November of 1917, Laura Blackwell, a scrub woman at the Fulton County Superior Court, was killed by a blow or blows from an axe. Found in her home at 233 East Fair Street, Laura's head was crushed, her throat cut, and her clothing reportedly destroyed by fire. In March of 1918, John Brown went to trial and was sentenced to life imprisonment for killing her. Granted a new trial, Brown was convicted once again for Laura Blackwell's murder in 1920. As three other black women had been found with their bodies burned or partially burned before Laura Blackwell, it's possible that Brown was responsible for those killings as well. The body of a 35-year-old black woman was found around 2 p.m. on Thursday, April 30th, 1918. She was found in a ditch in the woods near the Southern Railway tracks about a mile from Happaville by a farmer named R.P. Wood. The victim's skull had been fractured and her throat cut. At the time, Wood, walking from his home to Happaville, had discovered her. She had been dead for several hours. On Sunday, March 10th, 1918, the body of an unidentified dark mulatto was found at the top of a densely wooded hill above the West Point Beltline Railroad in the vicinity of Grant Street by residents in the neighborhood. The victim was reported to be 5'6", weighing approximately 130 pounds, and with hair slightly gray at the temple. She had been dead for roughly 24 hours when found, stabbed in the neck with a sharp instrument. On Sunday, March 16, 1919, Queen Esther Jackson was attacked and stabbed several times. She told police that she had stepped into her yard on East Harris Street for a drink of water from the hydrant when an unknown black male stepped from the darkness and stabbed her. Jackson died from her wounds on Tuesday morning, March 19th, at Grady Hospital. The body of an unidentified 25-year-old woman was found on the Southern Railroad tracks between Peyton Station and Chattahoochee Station on Sunday, May 4th, 1924. She had a knife wound to the temple, and there was evidence that a fight or scuffle had occurred before her murder. On Friday night, September 5th, 1924, the badly decomposed body of a 17-year-old girl had been discovered lying face down in a vacant lot on Pryor Street near the Southern Railroad. Her throat was slashed from ear to ear. It was reported that 3 black women had been found with their throats slashed in the previous 2 weeks, and in each instance, the shoes and stockings of the victims, as well as any jewelry, had been removed. On Monday, September 8, 1924, the body of an unidentified woman was found on Stewart Street near Dill Avenue. The victim, estimated to be around 30 years of age, had a bullet wound to the head, her throat cut, and terrible slashes to her wrists and back, and had been dead for roughly 24 hours when she was found.
The location of the bodies, nearly always found by a railroad track or something to do with the railroad, had to have meaning, especially to the killer. It's possible that the murderer may have worked for the railroad and did not stray far from the area with which he may have been familiar. As the trains would run in and out of Atlanta, usually on the weekends, it's also possible that the Ripper did not reside in Atlanta at all, but may have easily made his escape after assailing the women. The chronology and schedule with which he may have committed the murders relied on when he worked. Through hindsight, we can say that the Atlanta Ripper's murders may have fallen within the category of a psychosexual killer, much like that of Jack the Ripper. However, there is no record of letters being written or messages scrawled on alley walls by this killer. Black women may have fallen victim due to their accessibility to the killer, and with the social mores of the time, the so-called Atlanta Ripper may have operated longer without being apprehended. One other theory forwarded could be that he just hated black or biracial women, and he chose his victims as he found them. With the state of forensics in the early 20th century, police officers arrived at the crime scenes of the Atlanta Ripper hours, sometimes days, after the victims had been left there. Since it appeared that no visible pattern to the killings came to light, the enhanced police patrols still suffered from the rampant racism and lackadaisical attitude toward the killings allegedly exhibited through the authorities. Constant criticism and little help from the black community, instead of with the black pastors chastising the victims for contributing to their own death through divine intervention. It may have been nearly impossible to put an end to this historical reign of terror. To date, the Atlanta Ripper case remains unsolved. However, there was another famous murder case that occurred almost at the same time. In fact, a little bit after. It was the Leo Frank case, where he was accused of murdering Mary Fagan. One of the detectives that worked for the Leo Frank defense team, a gentleman by the name of William J. Burns, alleged that he had proof that Jim Conley, the prosecution's star witness, was actually the Atlanta Ripper. Unfortunately, that evidence did not come forward. Now, if you'd like to contribute to the channel, we're on PayPal, GoFundMe, and Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Hope you'll be with us. Until next time.